During May and June, I am preaching through a sermon series called How Long, O Lord, about suffering, loss, lament, and trust. And certainly during this season, many of you are experiencing those things. There's been all kinds of suffering happening over the last few months. Obviously, with the coronavirus, many people suffering with disease and death. Add on top of that all of the injustice we've seen in the world, the loneliness, the depression, the anxiety, all of this. And it's certainly a time of suffering. And I'm using for this sermon series a definition by a man named Mark Vrogop from a book called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. His definition of lament is this: a prayer in pain that leads to trust. A prayer in pain that leads to trust. And there's 4 movements in lament that we've talked about. Turn to God, voice your complaint, ask boldly, and choose to trust. In lament, it's the way that the Bible gives us to deal with our suffering. Instead of turning away from God in anger or turning to substances, addictions, or things of this world to numb our pain, we turn to God. And instead of stuffing down our emotions and our questions and our doubts, we pour them out to God. We voice them all to Him. And then instead of just resigning ourselves stoically to whatever's happening, we ask boldly for God, for justice, for His presence, for Him to show up and to act on our behalf. And then we choose to trust that no matter what comes our way, no matter what God does or doesn't do, that we're going to trust that He's good and that He loves us, and that He's always working things together for good. So this morning, what I want to do is to look at the first few chapters of an Old Testament book called Ecclesiastes. It's a very unique book, and I want to look particularly at what it teaches us about lamenting the futility of life. Lamenting the futility of life. And even though Ecclesiastes is not technically a lament, there are many lament elements in there that are going to be very instructive for us today and as we deal with the futility of our life. In case you're unfamiliar with what futility, as the dictionary defines it, is pointlessness or uselessness. It's the Greek myth of Sisyphus, forever pushing the boulder up the hill only to have it roll down the hill again when he reaches the top. It's that feeling. Futility is that feeling you get when you just finish cleaning your house after hours of cleaning and your children destroy it in a matter of 10 minutes. That's futility. Futility is the feeling you get after dieting for months to try to reach your target weight, only to watch yourself gain the weight back in a matter of weeks. That's futility. Futility is the feeling that you often get at work when you feel like you're working hard and putting in so much effort, and then you stop and you say, what difference does this all make? Futility is the feeling that the other teams in the AFC East had for the last 20 years as they put in all their hard effort knowing that in the end the Patriots would always win the division. Sorry, I had to put Tom Brady on there one last time before we retire those pictures. Or, to make it more serious, futility is the feeling that you may get watching another African-American man die an unjust death, knowing that despite all the protests and rallies that George Floyd was not the first unjust death of an African-American man, and he won't be the last one. That's futility. And so this morning we're going to look at Ecclesiastes and learn about what it has to teach us about futility. Listen to the first 3 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Let me do a quick background of this book. If you're unfamiliar with Ecclesiastes, it was written by someone who's quoting a teacher. In Hebrew, it's Kohelet. In Greek, it's Ecclesiastes. We're just going to call him the teacher for the sake of this. And so it's someone quoting the teacher. He refers to himself as the son of David, king over Jerusalem, which has led many people to think that it's Solomon, King Solomon, but I don't think that it is. I think it's a wisdom teacher who's writing a fictional autobiography, so to speak, taking on the persona of Solomon to explore the question of where to find meaning in this world. Solomon's a good persona to adopt because even though he was the richest and the wisest king, he ultimately turned away from God at the end of his life. He's a great example of someone who tried to find meaning, tried to find satisfaction in this world, but ultimately was unsuccessful in that search. So if you want to understand the teacher's point of view in this, you need to understand an important phrase that shows up here in the beginning, and that's this. under the sun. He says, what does man gain from all his labor under the sun? The term under the sun refers to life in this world, life in the secular frame. It's life under the sun here and now, not taking into account eternity or God's intervention. Basically, it's a thought experiment. He's saying, if this is all there is, if this life is all there is, there's no afterlife, God does not intervene, how are we going to find meaning in this life? How do we find meaning under the sun, life in this world? And the teacher's going to begin by pursuing wisdom and then pleasure and then achievement. He's going to look to things like justice and injustice, things like relationships and work and all of these things. And in the end, his conclusion is going to be what you read here in verses 1 through 3. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Meaningless is a word that occurs 35 times in this book, 4 times in these first 3 verses. And the Hebrew word translates here as meaningless. It means vanity in the King James as well. It's the word hebel, which translates as breath, breeze, or vapor. It's a way of saying that everything is transitory. It's ephemeral. It's elusive. It's like a vapor that's here and then gone. It's just beyond our grasp. It's resistant to being controlled or being caught. It feels like chasing after the wind is another expression he's going to use. Trying to catch something that just can't be caught. Something that's here and gone. He says that's what life is like. Trying to catch and grab onto something that is here and gone that you just can't hold on to. It's full, he says, of futility and frustration. That is life under the sun. You know, maybe you've experienced some of these. Maybe you have experienced putting all your effort into cleaning, and then as soon as you're done cleaning, the kids destroy it or the dog messes things up. Maybe you've experienced the futility or frustration of just wanting to be all set financially. Just wanting to get to the point where you feel like, all right, I'm in a good place. But then another thing breaks down. Another thing needs to be replaced. Another thing needs to be fixed. And there goes your bank account. Or maybe you've experienced the futility and frustration of I just want to have a close friend, just one friend who knows me and understands me that I could talk to. But every time I find one, they move away. Or just I can't seem to find someone who connects with me on that level. Maybe you have the frustration of I just want to enjoy my life, but I just feel like every time I turn my head, there's another suffering. There's another thing I have to suffer or experience. It just drags me down. Maybe you experience the frustration of I just want to be healthy, but my body won't cooperate. It just keeps breaking down on me. Or maybe you've experienced the futility and frustration of I just want to be the husband that I want to be, or the father, or the mother, the daughter. I just want to be the best that I can be, but I never seem to be able to get there. Or maybe this one, I just want to find a church that is a fulfilling community of love, but every church I go to just seems to fall short. Or maybe it's just that I just want to find some peace in this world, but nobody will let me live in peace. Or lastly, I just want to see justice in this world, but everywhere I turn, there's injustice and suffering, and there just seems to be no end in sight. That is futility. That is frustration. That is our lives in this world, under the sun, he says. Everywhere you look, it's like a vapor. You just can't grasp it. You're chasing after the wind, something that you'll never be able to grab onto. And maybe when you were young, it was easier to believe, or if you are young, it's easier to believe, you know what, someday I'll find the perfect love and the perfect job and everything will be great. But the longer you live in this life, you realize how much it's full of futility and frustration. So we're going to look at Ecclesiastes this morning, what we learn about lamenting our frustration. Another key word in this passage is found in verse 3, where he says, what does man gain from all his toil under the sun? Gain is the Hebrew word yitron, which is profit or reward. In other words, what's it all for? In the end, when I measure it all up, when I look back and take stock of what I've done, what was it all worth? What difference am I making? What is the purpose of all of this? Am I just here to work hard, suffer, and then die and ultimately be forgotten? Is that all I'm living for? What am I gaining from all my toil under the sun? Can you hear the lament in these verses? Can you hear how he's lamenting and just agonizing over all the sorrow and suffering that he's experiencing in this world, trying to find meaning and ultimately falling short? So I want to move on and just talk about some specific ways that he tries to find meaning, because there's some ways that are familiar to us and ways that we try to find meaning and purpose in this life. He begins by trying to find meaning in wisdom and learning. Verses 12 to 18 of chapter 1, it says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. And then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. So he pursues wisdom and learning, but he finds that as he pursues this, he sees just how difficult life is. The more he learns, the more it just seems sad and sorrowful. And he concludes that it's just he's not finding any meaning or purpose by becoming smarter, by learning more, by becoming wiser. Instead, he just feels like his sorrow and his suffering is increasing. And some of you may have experienced this reality. There's a term, blissful ignorance, that refers to just how when you don't know, sometimes you're just happier. Because he's saying if there's no God, if there's no life after death, then if you stop and think about it, life is pretty meaningless, and it's going to cause great sorrow. There's a quote by Thomas Nagel I want to share with you. He was a philosophy professor from NYU, and he wrote a book called What Does It All Mean? A very short introduction to philosophy. His last chapter in the book was on the meaning of life, and he wrote this: even if you produce a great work of literature which continues to be read thousands of years from now, you must remember that eventually the solar system will cool, or the universe will wind down and collapse, and all trace of your effort will vanish. If your life is going to matter, it can only matter from the inside, emotionally. From the outside, objectively, it wouldn't matter whether you had ever existed or not. But why dwell on that? Dwell on the thing that you're living for. Just try to enjoy life, and don't think too much about the big picture. How about that for advice from a philosophy textbook? Hey, it's like the Bobby McFerrin song, right? Don't worry, be happy. That's the best advice we can give. If you think about it too much, if there's no God and there's no life after death, then this is all ultimately meaningless. You're going to die, be forgotten, and eventually this world is going to collapse and just be destroyed, and it won't matter whether you existed or not or what you gave your efforts to. So just don't worry, be happy. Second thing, though, he decides, okay, so wisdom, I'm not finding any significance there. I'm going to start living for pleasure. Ecclesiastes 2, 1 through 11 says this: I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself, and I planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasures of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the hearts of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was my reward for all my labor. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So having turned from wisdom, he turns to pleasure. He says, I filled my life with laughter and wine and folly, projects, herds and flocks, silver and gold, singers and a harem, entertainment, sex, drink, money, possessions. As he puts it, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. And for many people, this sounds like bliss. This sounds like that's what I'm looking for, life to the fullest. If I could just deny myself no pleasure and do whatever it is I want, whenever I want, that would bring me satisfaction and joy. If I just had the money to travel anywhere I wanted to do, sex whenever I wanted, buy whatever I want, enjoy all the entertainment and dinners, concerts and sporting events that I want, that would be great. That would make my life meaningful. Surely I'd be happy then, right? But as he found out, he said, it's still just a chasing after the wind. It's grabbing onto things that you can't hold on to. They're here today, they're gone tomorrow, and you're looking on for the next one. You just can't keep that high that you seek. You can't live in that moment of ecstasy that you're longing for. Certainly this is most obvious when you look at our world and you look at addictions, what's known as tolerance, that when you try alcohol or drugs, that there's a tolerance factor, that you need more and more of them to reach that high. This is from a pamphlet on a certain drug called crystal meth. It says the first high is nearly impossible to duplicate. As users try to escape the rebound low and recreate that initial feeling, they take more and more of the drug. Addicted, users keep taking drugs long after it stops giving them pleasure, despite the consequences. It lowers dopamine levels and damages the brain. Hopefully none of you have or ever will experience that. But this is true for so many other things in this world as well. The pleasures that we seek, as we seek them, the high keeps getting lower and lower, and we need more and more and more of them in order to reach that place. Ecclesiastes 5, 10 through 12, he talks about money. He says, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. And this too is meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owner except to feast his eyes on them? The sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of a rich man permits him no sleep. He says, how much money is enough? A little more. We never have enough. And he says, the more that you have, the more anxiety you have, because the more things that you might lose, the more things you have to protect. In case you haven't noticed, the wealthier a nation gets, the more common depression is. There's a correlation there. Because as we accumulate more, we find to our horror that it hasn't given us the satisfaction that we've been looking for. It's not just the Bible that claims this. Science as well backs us up. On January 7th, 2017, the New York Times Magazine ran an interesting article called Happiness 101. It described positive psychology, a branch of psychology that seeks to take a scientific, empirical approach to what makes people happy. Researchers in this field have found that if you focus on doing things and getting things that give you pleasure, it does not lead to happiness, but produces what one researcher has dubbed the hedonic treadmill. You become addicted to pleasure, and your need for pleasure fix keeps growing. You have to do more and more. You're never really satisfied, never really happy. So just in case you doubted, that's science saying what Kohelet, the teacher, has said, what the Bible has said. If you seek after pleasure, you're going to get on this treadmill where you need more and more and more, and it's never really going to satisfy you. So he moves on to work and achievement. He says, well, if wisdom didn't do it, pleasure didn't do it, how about work and achievement? But he says this too felt like a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 2:11, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. And furthermore, he goes on to talk about how alienating work can be. In 4, 7, and 8, he says, again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This, too, is meaningless, a miserable business. He just talks about how work can be so alienating that you could find yourself pouring yourself out at work and having nothing then to give to those you love, or having no one to share it with because you've been working so hard. Finally, he says there's no guarantee that anything we do will have any lasting meaning. In Ecclesiastes 2, 18 to 21, he says, I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the work into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. So he tried wisdom and found that it was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. He tried pleasure and found the same, and now he tries toil and work and achievement, and he finds the same thing. It just feels meaningless. Like I'm pushing that boulder up the hill only to have it roll down again. Like I'm banging my head against the wall. Like I'm gaining nothing under the sun. He goes on in chapter 4 to even look at justice, and he says this, again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, who has not yet seen the evil that is done under the sun. It's a very pessimistic outlet, but he's saying, if this world is all there is and God does not intervene and there's no life after death, it's meaningless. Think about it. You look around the world, and yes, we're all focused on one particular type of injustice right now, the racial inequalities in our land. But even if that went away, look around the world at all the other injustice. Look at all the children who are going to bed hungry, while some of us are throwing away our extra food. Look at those who don't even have clean water or sanitation where they live. And here we are taking for granted the showers, the clean water that we have every day. Look at all of those dying of diseases that can be easily prevented if they just had the medications that we have. Look at the children forced into slavery, the women who are treated as second-class citizens or property around the world, children and babies who are murdered before they even have a chance to live. Again, if you stop and you actually think about it, the injustice is overwhelming under the sun. It's like overcoming injustice is trying to empty out the ocean with a teaspoon, as it said. And so he looks around and he just says, it's just so meaningless. So how are we going to deal with the futility of this life? When you feel like you're just pushing that boulder up the hill and have it roll back down again, how do you deal with the futility, the frustration of your existence? Is it just adopt the don't worry, be happy mentality, just don't think about it too much? Is it just keep trying harder and harder and harder until you get there? Or is there a better way? Well, again, I want to encourage you to consider lament. That we turn to God, that we pour out our complaint and voice our frustration and talk about our futility with God. And then we ask boldly. We don't give up. We continue to ask boldly that God would bring justice, that God would give us joy in our labor, that God would give us work that is meaningful, that God would give us relationships that are not futile. We continue to ask for those things boldly. And we continue to pour out and give ourselves to working for those things. But in the end, the last thing there is that we choose to trust in God and not in the things of this world. That we're going to stop looking to the things of this world to provide meaning. And we start looking to God for the meaning, the satisfaction, the purpose that we're looking for. C.S. Lewis put it this way in The Weight of Glory. He said, the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them. It only came through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. You could substitute anything else for the books or the music there in the first line. He's saying that desire you have, that everything would be in its right place in your home, that you would have that feeling of peace, knowing that everything has been cleaned. He says, if you trust in that, it's going to betray and destroy you. The longing that is coming through that is a longing for God, the longing for eternity, the longing for that day when you will be with God and everything will be in its right place. He says, in other words, think about justice, that longing you have for justice, that everything would be right, that there would be no oppressor oppressed, that there would be no injustice, that everything would be perfectly fair. He says, if you're trusting and looking for that this side of heaven, again, you're setting up an idol that is going to destroy you. But if you recognize that what you are truly longing for and desiring, it comes through that. It's beyond that. It's found in God. It's found in the kingdom of God where there is perfect justice, where we will be forever with him. Then, and only then, will you find the peace, the justice you're looking for. Substitute anything else that I've talked about today for that books and music. If you're looking to it in this world to fulfill you, to give you that satisfaction, it's going to destroy you. There's something beyond that that we're longing for. As C.S. Lewis put it in Mere Christianity, he said, "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world." If you find yourself longing for that perfect friend, for that perfect spouse, for the perfect community, for the perfect pleasure that will never leave you, that perfect joy, that perfect peace, all of those things that you find yourself longing for, that feels like you're chasing after the wind, that you're grabbing at it and then it's gone. It says the explanation is that you were made for another world. You were made for a relationship with God. That is where you will find what it is you're looking for. As the teacher in Ecclesiastes put it, in Ecclesiastes 3:11, he has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. The point is, it's not wrong to enjoy food and travel and music and relationships and all the pleasures that God gives us in this world. But if you're looking to those things to satisfy you, to give you the joy and the pleasure and the peace and everything that is you're looking for, you're going to be disappointed. You're going to be betrayed. You're going to be broken down. You're supposed to be looking through those to who it is who gives you those things, to God himself. As it says in Psalm 37, verse 4, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." This is not a formula that if you delight yourself in God, he's going to give you, a car and things like that. It's no, if you delight yourself in God, he will give you the desires of your heart. The things that you've been longing for will be met and found in him. Or Psalm 16:11, "You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand." That means pleasures that last forever, that are not chasing after the wind, but will be yours forever. Or as St. Augustine put it, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you." Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. Or John 10:10, Jesus said, "The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Are you getting the message here? You're hearing these repeated themes that if you're looking for the things of this world, you are going to experience constant futility and frustration. If you think that they will provide what it is your heart is longing for, it'll be a life of futility and frustration. Look beyond them to the God who gives good gifts and find your meaning in him. Let me read again. This is the verse we read at the beginning of the service, Isaiah 55. "Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good, and your soul will delight in the richest of fare. Give ear and come to me. Hear me, that your soul may live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, my faithful love promised to David." When you find your joy in the Lord, it's not that all the futility and frustration go away immediately, but you begin to have the proper perspective on which to approach life, on which to approach wisdom and learning and justice and pleasure and toil and achievement and all of these things. You begin to have the proper perspective because you're not looking to those things to give you the satisfaction and the joy and the peace and the love that you're longing for. You recognize that all those things are found in God and they will be ours forever. And so you can approach the things of this life enjoying what you can from God, but not looking to them to satisfy you. Remember, at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, the chapter on the resurrection, Paul writes this, "Therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." You see that last word there? It's not in vain. Remember the King James translation of Ecclesiastes? Vanity, vanities. It's all vanities. It's all meaningless. It's all chasing after the wind. And here is Paul saying, because of the resurrection, because there is life after death, nothing is in vain. And you need to hear that. I need to hear that this morning. Nothing is in vain. That everything you do in the name of the Lord has eternal significance. Nothing is in vain. Nothing is futile. Nothing is just pushing the rock up the hill. Everything that you do as a believer, as one trusting in the Lord, matters eternally. What good news is that? That is so good to hear for those of us who feel like our lives and our work and our relationships, and everything we're doing is just meaningless, a chasing after the wind. It just feels so futile and vain and meaningless. Here comes Paul to say, no, because of the resurrection, it is all meaningless. It all has eternal significance. Bruce Milne put it this way: every kingdom work, whether publicly performed or privately endeavored, partakes of the kingdom's imperishable character. Every honest intention, every stumbling word of witness, every resistance of temptation, every motion of worship, every struggle towards obedience, every mumbled prayer, everything, literally, which flows out of our faith relationship with the ever-living one will find its place in the ever-living heavenly order, which will dawn at his coming. Just soak that in to that part of you that just feels like life right now is futile, that feels like life is meaningless, that feels like life is pointless, the part of you that feels like you're banging your head against the wall and getting nowhere, pushing a rock up the hill, spinning your wheels. Everything that you do as a believer in the Lord matters eternally. Everything you do matters eternally. Somehow, everything we do has eternal significance. And so enjoy the gifts that God has given you. Love your spouse if you have one. Raise your kids in love if you have kids. Work at your job with all that you have. But put it all in the proper perspective. All of these things will not fulfill you. Nothing in this world is going to give you the satisfaction you're longing for. It's going to be a chasing after the wind. Even if you get it for a moment, it will be gone the next. You can't hang on to it. It'll only be a fleeting memory. All of these good gifts are meant to point you to the giver of those good gifts, to look to God, to find the meaning and satisfaction that you're longing for. Your marriage, or your desire for marriage, or your desire for a better marriage, points to the love relationship that you have with God that you will have with him forever. Your work, whether it's rewarding or unrewarding, or you're looking for a job, it's just a shadow of the real thing, the real fulfillment you have when you are with God reigning over the world, the new heavens and the new earth forever. Your family, your church, all of these imperfect things are just a shadow of the perfect family, the perfect community we will have forever when we're with God. And even your desire for justice points you to the perfect justice in the kingdom of God when everything will be set right. There will be no more oppression. So for all that futility and frustration that you're experiencing this side of heaven, don't let it stop you. Don't let it make you give up. Say, well, there's just no point. There's no point in any of this. No. Give yourself fully to the work of the Lord. Continue to work for justice. Continue to work on having a better marriage, or being a better parent, or being a better employee. Continue to work on these things. Not because you think they're going to satisfy you if you get to a better place, but because everything you do matters eternally. Because you know that everything you do for God is going to have eternal significance. Instead of despairing or letting things drive you crazy, let them point you instead to Jesus. Let them be a reminder that this world was never meant to satisfy you, that the brokenness of this world will be fixed when Christ returns to set all things right. Again, in conclusion, always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because everything that you do to honor him is eternally significant. Amen.